Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning if you are in British Columbia and the Yukon Territories. Welcome to this last session of day 2 of the Disability and Work in Canada Conference. My name is Dr. Mahadio Sukai. I am a thought leader and founder in the space of accessibility in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and healthcare. And I co-run a consulting enterprise called Idea STEM that focuses on accessibility in STEM and healthcare. I am a member of the Disability and Work in Canada Steering Committee for the 2024 virtual conference, and I am very pleased to welcome you today to this session, the second breakout on day 2 of the conference. The session is called Not Just a Tourist, Mapping Tourism Competencies for Inclusive Futures of Persons with Disabilities in Canada. If this is not the session that you wanted to be in, stay anyway. I assure you it's going to be a fun time. So I'm here to basically just moderate this and kick this off. I'm going to give you a visual description of myself as well. I am a brown-skinned South Asian Indo-Caribbean male of medium height with mostly black hair, very thick glasses, and I'm wearing a black headset today. I am in my basement office at home in Kingston, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat peoples. And I'm wearing a dark blue shirt with a white and light blue striped tie. So welcome. I trust you are all agreeing with me that you're in the right place. Again, this is the Not Just a Tourist panel, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you Jasmine Key from HR Tourism Canada, and Peter Field and Andy Livingston, who are both research consultants. This work was done by the Canadian National Institute for the Blind research team, and Peter and Andy worked on the project. I do encourage you to check out everyone's biographies for this session on the DWC conference website. I will note that there is going to be a live question and answer period after the presentation. Jasmine, Andy, and Peter will take about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for a live discussion. And when you do the live discussion, what we'll ask you to do is type your question into the Q&A box or into the chat. This is a Zoom webinar, so there is a Q&A box as well as the chat. I will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat. So type your question in either spot, and I will read your question out, and one of Jasmine, Andy, and Peter will answer it. We will not do raising your hand. That might be a little bit too logistically cumbersome, so we'll ask you to just type your question in the chat box or in the Q&A. So that's my introductory announcements and instructions for the group. I'm pleased to turn this over to Jasmine and Peter and Andy. And Jasmine, you go first.
Thank you, Mahadio, for the introduction of the panel. Hello, everyone. My name is Jasmine Qi. I'm the Director of Workforce Inclusion at Tourism HR Canada. And I really appreciate this opportunity provided by the Disability and Work Conference Canada to give us this opportunity to share an initiative we have been completed. As some of you may know, the data from the 2022 Canadian Survey on Disability and Census Trends underscore a critical need for promoting inclusivity and accessibility within the tourism sector. With 27% of Canadians aged 15 and older living with one or more disabilities, an increase of 1.8 million people since 2017, and only 62% of working age individuals with disabilities employed, compared to 78% of those without. There is an undeniable gap that requires action. Tourism employers are uniquely positioned to make a significant impact. Among employed individuals with disabilities, nearly 350,000 workers are in tourism industries, with women comprising 61% of this workforce. However, the employment rates across tourism industries remain inconsistent, with recreation and entertainment industries leading at 74.2%, while the accommodation industry lags at 63.8%. This disparity highlights an opportunity to elevate accessibility and inclusivity practices across all tourism industries. The census data further reveals a growing representation of workers with disabilities in the tourism sector, rising from 12.3% in 2011 to 32.6% in 2021. This trend reflects not only the increasing visibility of persons with disabilities in the workforce, but also the need for targeted tools, resources, and services to support their success and retention in the tourism sector. This skills and competency mapping research is part of Tourism HR Canada's Belong project, which is a 3-year pan-Canadian initiative funded by Employment and Social Development Canada under the Opportunities Fund for Persons with Disabilities. This research project has mapped the competencies of 25 tourism occupations against the skills and accommodation needs of at least 5 identified disability groups. Drawing on Tourism HR Canada's competency framework and insights from disability experts, the research aligned employability skills with job-specific requirements, highlighting opportunities for inclusion. The resulting tools will provide a clear and practical guide for employers, including recommendations for adapting roles, such as enabling remote work where feasible. This research also aims to support tourism employers in building inclusive workplaces while unlocking the potential of underutilized talent and to create more opportunities for people with disabilities to join and thrive in the tourism workplace. So this is the introduction of the project, and we are very pleased to have the opportunity to collaborate with the CNIB's research team and with consultants Peter and Andy. So now I will pass the baton to Peter and Andy to introduce the project.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. That's a great introduction to the project. And just to provide some additional context, want to say that Andy, you'll hear, was on the project myself, and a researcher by the name of Michaela Knott. I know Michaela's listening today and will join in if for some reason we run into some kind of trouble, but I just want to call out Michaela for the amazing work that she did on the project as well as part of the research team. So as Jasmine said, we performed a skills and competency mapping of 25 tourism-related occupations. And what we wanted to do was to understand the enablers and barriers to various disability groups on these tourism jobs. We focused on, in fact, 6 disabilities in our research, reaching out to individuals who are deafblind, people with seeing and hearing disabilities, physical disabilities, individuals who had acquired a brain injury, and individuals who had mental health disabilities. Like all of our research with the CNIB research team, we took a mixed methods approach, a mixed methodology approach. I just want to, I'll just back up for a second to say as well that I'm going to be focusing a bit more on methodology, and Andy's going to be focusing on the results. And the reason why I'm going to spend some time on methodology is because it was a very important part of the project and getting to those results and getting to the outcomes that Jasmine and Tourism HR Canada were looking for. So we actually held 3 separate literature reviews as part of this project. Our first literature review would be the sort of traditional landscape review to see what was happening internationally in terms of the employment of persons with disabilities in the tourism sector. we then did a second literature review simply on common barriers of employment of persons with disabilities not related to tourism sector. And we did something called a literature review on organizational signaling. And I'll talk about the importance of organizational signaling as we get into the project. So what we decided to do was to do 2 levels of analysis. And I'm going to break this down for you a little bit because Jasmine talked about the 25 occupations that we were to look at. There were indeed 25 tourism-related jobs, but underneath those jobs was a set of competencies, and quite a number of competencies. There are, in fact, 410 competencies that we needed to look at altogether. So that was our level 1, was to look at each competency and determine what barriers and enablers there were inside those competencies. Part of that job profile, part of those 25 job profiles was a short job description. So that was our level 2 analysis, was to look at that probably half a page job description, very high level on what that job would do, and look at that for barriers. So for people who aren't familiar with the kind of lingo here, you've got the job description, which is what you do, and you've got the competencies, which is how you do them, and we focused on both those things. We held focus groups with 48 individuals, many of those virtually. So we tried to pull in as many people as possible. Most of those were people with disabilities, so we had a couple of employers and people working in the area of employment supports as well. And we did an online survey of the types of individuals who support individuals with disabilities to find jobs. So those people working in the supported employment sector. What we ended up doing was really coming up with our own framework of how to proceed. When we looked around to see if there were any existing competency frameworks that could get to where we wanted to go, there wasn't any, so we kind of made up our own framework. So as I said, in our level 1, we looked at the 410 competencies. And then in our level 2, we looked at barriers to employment in the job descriptions, cross-reference with the National Occupational Classification System. So in other words, we had a sort of a half a page description of what a line cook did, but then we looked on the National Occupational Classification System for a description as well of what a line cook would do, or a banquet server, and that helped us round that job description out. So getting to the heart of what we did in our level 1, so looking at the 410 competencies, we started with the 34 that were common across all of the job profiles. So across the 25 job profiles, there are 34 competencies, which every single job profile had. And we sort of honed our analysis by working as a team on those 34. We came up with 10 criteria related that we could use for analysis. And some of these included, was there a red flag? In other words, was there something we needed to highlight right away, which presented a big risk to Tourism HR Canada and those competencies? Was this competency an individual strength or an employee need? So in other words, was it something that someone brought to the job, or was it something that the employer was asking for? Was it a technical or behavioral competency? Was it performed on-site, remotely, or hybrid of those two? So that got to if you were accommodating or taking into account diverse needs, you had that option of that spectrum of working on-site, a remote, or a hybrid setting. And could the job be divided? So very important as well. And Andy will probably talk about that in his part, which is if you can divide up a job, which looks like it's not going to be accessible to somebody, all of a sudden you can get people in those roles. At the job profile stage, so that was our level 2, we looked for barriers. And we looked at what the consequences were to employers if that barrier was still there. We also looked at solutions and supports to those barriers. Was there a best practice or innovation that could be brought to that barrier and to that job? And what was the benefit to the employer of removing the barrier? So what did we mean by barriers? Well, we used the list of barriers from the Accessible Canada Act, which probably most people are familiar with here. So the built environment, transportation, communications, attitudinal barriers, information communications technology barriers, and physical barriers and policies and practices. So at a very high level, that's how we proceeded. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andy, and he can tell you what we found.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to run this part a little bit differently. Peter and I will go through the summaries of the findings, but I would like Peter to have the ability to jump in if there's anything that he wishes to highlight along with me.
Sure.
We are a very collaborative team, so I would like his input into what we found as well as my own. From the competencies, we found 156 barriers across more than 5 disability groups, as Peter described. Unfortunately, barriers exist for persons with disabilities across all professions and competencies. We identified, Peter mentioned the red flags earlier. We identified red flags in 20 of the competencies, and this is not a reflection of how the competencies were wrote at all, but it's more about signals that would give individuals with disabilities reasons to not feel that the competency was a fit for them within the job description. So we found from our research that people with disabilities tended to screen themselves out of jobs naturally by seeing competencies within the job descriptions and within the way things were presented or wording. So we highlighted that within the research. We also found that individuals who had intersectionality of disability or multiple disabilities faced the greatest number of barriers. But I also, as part of this work, wanted to highlight that most supports for people within the workplace cost under $500, and they're able to achieve and flourish within a job for a significant minimal cost to the employer, and the value that employers get from hiring people with disabilities, the level of lived experience, the assets they bring to the job far outweigh the cost of providing them support.
Can I jump in there then, Andy, just to pick up on a couple of points there?
Sure.
Yeah, so part of what Andy's talking about there, and I referred to it earlier, is organizational signaling. So that is when employer or prospective employer signals that they are open to hiring that their policies and practices and systems are accessible, and they're open to accommodation, well, support, if you don't like that word accommodation, support for persons with disabilities in that work. So the classic example that we sort of came across in this was the adventure guide job, where people lead canoe trips and dog sledding exercises and hiking, mountain hiking. And when you look at the job description and even the competencies, people self-select out. They go, well, there's no way I could do that job if I've got a disability. But then when we have that conversation with them about, well, what if there is somebody there to support you? Then all of a sudden, many people were interested in the job. So that kind of organizational signaling that, we're open to discussion about how you can do this job, and there's more than one way of doing this job, made a huge difference. And that goes to Andy's point again about costs, right? Many of these solutions were not costly. If it was simply dividing up the task or moving things around, there is virtually no cost for that kind of support. Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
That's okay. It's a great value add. We found that almost just looking at tasks from a different lens, or readjusting, or as Peter said, one of the categories we used was, could the job task be split up or reassigned or done differently? And we found that a lot of them could, allowing individuals with disabilities to feel welcomed and give that signaling, as Peter said, that organizations are open to hiring people with disabilities. They would be welcomed as an employee and feel supported and valued. We did find that the Adventure Guide had the largest number of barriers to the most disability groups, but we also found that if, as Peter said, with that role, if we changed the lens of how we were discussing it and went through the job description piece by piece, individuals were like, oh, well, if that was adjusted or I had support with that, I would love to apply for that job. I'd never thought of myself in that role. So a lot of it was both changing the lens of employers, but also changing the lens of prospective employees as well. We did find that employers were in need of accessibility training and inclusion to support people with disabilities, and recognize that strengthen the ability of employers to bring people with disabilities to the workplace. We definitely found that not all people within a disability group experience is the same or bring the same skills or abilities to a position, and the same goes true for barriers. Not everyone that has low vision, for example, are going to have the same barriers, even though their disability category is quite similar. So there is a danger in pigeonholing people into groups and just assuming that the barriers they experience are similar. For example, the ability to get to the job and transportation. People can have, a very similar disability characteristic, but how they do that, how they complete tasks, how they're able to use their abilities to thrive in a job is very different. So that was important to highlight as well.
Can I pick up on a point there, Andy? Because
Sure.
you just reminded me of a main focus of why we did what we did and how we did what we did. Is there were sort of two ways of going about this. One, which I would call an older paradigm, where you say, okay, we've got these jobs. Tell us what people with disabilities can do this jobs and what accommodations they need. I'm going to call that an older paradigm, we took more of a social model, I guess, approach, which is where we say, no, it's not about fitting people with disabilities into jobs. It's surveying these jobs to see where the barriers are so that people with disabilities can fit into those the way that they fit. And that gets what you're talking about there, Andy, is that, nowhere in this exercise was a kind of a one size fits all approach. It was let's see where these jobs offer barriers so that as many people as possible can be recruited into these jobs, and supported in these jobs. So that was really important to us as we started out in the project.
One thing that I thought was really important to flag was that within these competency findings, the barriers to varying degrees could be potentially mediated in combination or as an individualistic approach by the person, the employer, the technology, or the environment. The key thing is to, in my view, from the findings, was to be proactive in attempting to find ways to mediate barriers that exist. If there's a willingness to attack the barriers and address the barriers, that goes a long way to eliminating them and allowing an individual to thrive.
Yeah, I would agree. If you look at the 410 competencies and you say, well, there's only 20 that stood out to us as having huge red flags, that's pretty good. If we say, with a little bit of work, all of these can be open. The other thing that we found was that there were very few jobs that people with disabilities conceivably could not do. I can think of just a handful of ones, some, and most of those involved, you got to be able to drive an ATV. We know that that let out a certain segment of persons with disabilities, but really there was very few of those. We'll call them BFORs. Very few of those bona fide occupational requirements that we actually came across.
Looking at the barriers within the job profiles, we found that there was 156 potential barriers across 25 job profiles. There was an average of about 6 barriers per role, and two with the most barriers, were a venture guide and line cook. But as we stated earlier, like a lot of those barriers could be alleviated with some thought, creativity, and communication. A large part of barrier elimination we found was communication and dialogue with the employee and that was a big part of it. The roles that had the least number of barriers were hotel accommodation and accommodations, sales and marketing, and event management. One thing we found was that a lot of those jobs within those categories had a lot of repetition that were consistent, so supports could be put in place and an individual would be allowed to thrive. Some of the barriers that we discovered was interaction with the public and the expectations with that. But again, those could be alleviated with a teamwork approach or with a different way of interacting, a different way of offering those supports, and also a different way of knowing and accomplishing the tasks. We found that with adaptability, a lot of the barriers could be alleviated and in a lot of cases eliminated. We found that the greatest number of barriers were in food and beverage, the tour guide type fields, where individuals would maybe forced to do a number of tasks that may alter over time, and also that they were expected to be alone at times with limited support. Very interesting finding. We found that as individuals progressed into managerial roles and leadership roles, the barriers decreased significantly. But one thing that Peter, Michaela, and I wanted to point out was, in a lot of cases, a lot of the managerial roles require and leadership roles had significant requirements to fulfill roles underneath those roles prior to getting those opportunities. So one of the barriers that and analysis that we undertook was, noticing that if individuals had to fulfill lower ranking roles prior to getting those opportunities, once they were in managerial roles and leadership roles, they were able to accommodate themselves, make adjustments, being in leadership roles, self-support in a way. But in order to get those opportunities, one, you needed length of service, which could be difficult, as well as needing to have experienced roles underneath the people you were supervising, which had greater number of barriers. So we saw that as the biggest barrier, I think, to getting into leadership roles in our analysis and discussion. Maybe Peter can help enhance my interpretation of that.
No, that was excellent, Andy. But I just wanted to add that, to me, that was one of the biggest ironies of the project, is that people struggled to identify with being able to do some of these lower level jobs, or entry level jobs, I should say, such as housekeeping, line cooks, servers, adventure guides. But as soon as we brought to them the job profile related to director and managerial, they saw themselves in those positions right away. And that's, I guess, the way we normally structure work, which is to say, you've got to spend your time in these entry-level jobs first, and then you've got to kind of work your way up, and then eventually, maybe you can attain a manager or leadership position. But those are the most accessible jobs. People are using IT. As long as those IT systems are accessible, you're working with people, you're managing staff, you can manage a budget. There's none of the sort of inherent barriers that we see in the more entry-level jobs. So to me, this then becomes an opportunity for employers to look at that and say, if I'm serious about recruiting people in, can we look at some of those roles? Now, we know that there's education that usually needs to go behind that, and you can't sort of wave that away. But looking at the abilities of people to do those higher level jobs in perhaps a different path or a different time frame is certainly an opportunity for employers.
Just a note, although it's slightly out of the scope of this study, one thing of note to what Peter was saying was we see that within work that both this research team and others have completed, there are many barriers to education for people with disabilities within the education sector and within research positions. And we find that, people with disabilities may have gaps in their employment, which unfortunately, with the systems we use to recruit, is another barrier to people getting leadership positions, where Peter said, as eloquently mentioned, they're able to see themselves in that positions, which is important. But then we have to create an environment allowing individuals with disabilities to have promotion opportunities and and things like that in order to get to these positions. And you know, one thing we found also is, at least for those with physical disabilities, such as myself, the built environment was a huge barrier. So again, if the environment was accessible, many people saw themselves being able to do positions. You know, as Peter mentioned, if IT systems were accessible and usable by all, those barriers were eliminated. And as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, individuals who were deafblind experienced the greatest number of barriers. So if we saw intersectionality of, you know, different disability characterizations and individuals had other challenges, you know, and found themselves in multiple categories, they experienced the most barriers. We found that individuals who had mental health related disabilities experienced the lowest amount of barriers, but it is important to note that many of those conditions are episodic. So the barriers that they experience may be more severe at times within their job, and maybe a little could be dormant at times as well. So having employers tuned to the episodic nature of disability is important as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Andy, and I'm wondering whether what you said earlier in terms of the built environment meant that there were perhaps less barriers for people with mental health issues, because although, as you said, they're struggling with perhaps some other issues, you know, navigating around a kitchen or being able to serve people and so on wouldn't have the same kind of physical barriers for people with mental health issues or other invisible disability, let's say, then let's say persons who have physical disabilities or persons with sight loss, for example. So when we looked at, okay, are there ways that the built environment can be changed and modified, then that opened up some of those more problematic jobs as well, such as cooks and servers and so on.
In terms of conclusions, we found that there's a limited amount of research to document employment experiences of persons with disability within the tourism sector, and we hope this work will lead to other research projects within the sector. And the openness to hiring and the proactive approach, seeing people with disabilities as an untapped labor market, training employers, providing them documentation and guides to allow people with disabilities to flourish are key solutions. We noticed that the barriers and solutions are not much different in this sector compared to other sectors of the economy. So these are barriers that are seen throughout various sectors of the economy. It should be noted that many people that we came in contact with through the research felt that they could see themselves working in this sector with appropriate supports and in high-level areas of the sector as well, and could see themselves fulfilling many roles within it. Did you have anything to add, Peter, about our findings?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that, Andy, because it was very striking when we did the focus groups. We sort of asked people at the beginning of the groups if they'd had any experience in the tourism sector, and some had limited experience, some had some experience at one time, it didn't work out. And then as we went through the jobs and we talked about the jobs and we talked about reducing barriers, there was a real appetite for either going back to that or jumping into that. So I think the expectation is that this is a sector that could open up for people more than it has before, and that was good to see. But it's definitely something that people are keen to tap into if the tourism sector is open to hiring, and again, emphasizing the importance of organizational signaling. I'm an employer. I have this job. My workplace is accessible. My systems are accessible. I'm willing to accommodate. So let's have a discussion about how you might fit in with my workplace. So contextualizing that somehow in the context of your recruitment.
Yeah, just to add to what Peter said, I think the organizational signaling is a key piece, right? So that people can see themselves in these roles or can feel that they could thrive in these roles and gain meaningful employment and gain a level of organizational loyalty. I think that initial kind of interaction with those job descriptions is key in creating a lens of we see potential in you, we see growth opportunities, we want you to be part of our organization, we want you to fulfill this role. We're gonna allow you to put in a situation where it allows you to succeed rather than come up against barriers. And I think that signaling, as Peter eloquently said, is key in individuals applying for these roles, because obviously the first step for employers is getting applicants and getting good applicants and strong applicants, which many people with disabilities can be if given the opportunity. But if your signaling isn't there initially, then they're going to screen themselves out, which is one clear finding that we found.
Yeah, definitely. People would self-select out without a conversation about how they can do this job and the potential of them to do these jobs. Many of them just simply self-selected out, and the employer would never know what potential was there. Anything? Go ahead, Andy.
Also like creating, a accessible and welcoming interview process, and through your HR mechanisms, creating a system where people feel supported in that process before they become, an employee was important as well.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I have a feeling that Jasmine's going to pick up on some of those points as she talks about what the next steps are.
Jasmine, you have 5 minutes. Do you want me to leave the slides on?
Okay, yeah, it's okay to leave the slides on. And thank you, Andy and Peter, really talking about how our sector take the proactive initiative approach to make sure we can eliminate the barriers existing in the environment for people with disabilities to thrive in the sector. So Tourism HR Canada, we have planned the development of a national disability resource guide aimed at supporting tourism businesses on their journey in successfully hiring and retaining individuals with disabilities, with dedicated units broken down by overarching disability categories as recognized by the Canadian Survey on Disability. And this resource guide is built on the findings from this particular skills and competency mapping project, and also the research our own research team have taken on about belong workforce and employer surveys. So we are also going to launch series of e-learning course which titled as Navigate Inclusive Tourism Workplaces. This e-learning course is developed for the tourism sector employers and their staff, from staff level, how to support their co-workers with disabilities in their workplace, to middle managers and senior leaders, how to integrate the accessibility as a strategic direction for their business. So we also plan to host the Inclusive Employment and Workplaces in Tourism Regional Conference. Actually, we just already launched the registration. This conference will be hosted at Calgary on March 12th, which will be a transformative day dedicated to accessibility and inclusion in the tourism sector, with insightful discussions, practical tools, service provider expo, and a shared commitment to shaping an inclusive future of tourism. Beyond this, we are also going to take on a tourism workplace accreditation program to accredit tourism workplaces with their best practices in hiring and retaining people with disabilities. So we really appreciate this opportunity from ESDC to implement the series of initiatives to make our sector more accessible and inclusive. Thank you.